This is the summation at the beginning here that I'm going to try to take about just a very few minutes to kind of get us into the mindset. We've been talking for a few weeks now about, hello, we've been talking a few weeks now about the fossil record and how it is said to construe or yeah, by a lot of people that there are transitions from one species to another. And we talked about the fact that if there are these transitions, then there should be more transitions than actual things we see. So if there's stuff in between a monkey and a man, there should be more fossils of that in between than there is of the monkeys and the man, or any of the other ones. There should be this enormous amount, and they don't find it. It's not there. We talked about this chart. We talked about several of them on there that are known now to either be hoaxes or they are highly questioned even by top scientists as to whether or not they're actual missing links or just wishful thinking. These are some of the ones that we found that were either hoaxes or were ones that they honestly might have thought that they were transitions, but have found since that they're not. One of the big things nowadays is going and for evolutionists to point out that all of these kinds of flippers and fins all have a common design, and it looks like to some people that one goes to the next one, to the next one, to the next one in a nice smooth gradation, so that shows evolution. But for me, when I look at it, I see a common design so that it's a good design that should be used, and if there's a designer, he uses the same process over and over and over again. I don't see it the same way that they do. In other words, we talked about Archaeopteryx, which is the most famous supposed half bird, half dinosaur. And we looked at both sides and we saw that they say it's half and half, but there are many reputable, even atheistic scientists that say, no, it's just a bird. And the biggest one nowadays that I'm finding is that there's supposedly a transition between something down here, something, it's a hippo or a bear or some other ones I can't pronounce, that make a simple gradation up through to the whale, so that there's the Pakicetus and the Rhodocetus and this one and this one. But we looked at the evidence and how the actual person that originally found one of these, we watched him being questioned, and his answer is, yeah, on the, I think it was Rhodocetus, but it could have been the other one, I can't remember. He said, no, you're right, we didn't find the back half of it. Okay, so we don't know that it had a tail, we don't know that it had the rotating part, we just kind of put it in there because we thought that's what it was. And to this day, they don't have it. In fact, they found some scents that have the hind legs. But we've got Richard Dawkins, the most noted spokesman for evolution nowadays, on tape. We showed that tape where he's using this exact illustration, this exact picture to prove his point that, yeah, we have lots of transitional forms. It's not true. Okay, they don't have them. I'm not saying that evolution can't be true. I'm just saying it's highly doubtful. It's like we said in the beginning. You can't prove that there's a God, but you can't prove that there's not a God. Proof. I'm talking about beyond the shadow of a doubt. You have to look at what? Lots and lots of evidence. And then make a decision which way that evidence points. And I contended through this entire part of the series where we talked about fossils that we don't begin with the fossils. We should never begin with the fossils, okay? Because I think the fossils can be interpreted one way or another. They really can. And I think myself that the evidence shows that the fossil record shows something different than an evolutionary process. You begin by deciding which came first, mind or matter. And that goes back to the very beginning classes that we did. You begin with, is there a mind first or is there matter first? Because if there's matter first, then your mind came from inert matter. And I refuse to believe that. That we got highly, highly, highly intelligent beings that came from a rock. Zero intelligence in the beginning if you are an atheistic evolutionist. Zero. No thought, no feeling, no logic, no nothing. Okay? And they have to go from there. They try to explain how we got from a monkey to a man. The biggest explanation for me is how the chemistry and electricity changed from a rock into a mind. Yes?
That would also mean that we're going to keep evolving and the logic and the mind is going to expand.
That is why AI is so big. I'm telling you that it is not simply a thing, hey, we got something we can do with AI that will make our lives easier. The whole push for AI, and I've read articles on this, is so that they can show the next level of evolution.
Which wouldn't be natural evolution, so it doesn't prove their point.
Man, not as far as I'm concerned, because the mind is doing it. You see what I'm, yeah, you're seeing exactly what I'm trying to show. It's the exact same reason why there's cryogenics. You know what that is?
Freezing yourself for the future?
Yourself or your head or whatever. Yeah, exactly. Okay, there's a lot of fields. It's the exact reason why they're looking so far out into the universe with these long, long telescopes to try to show that. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Contact, okay? It was a while back. It was Jodie Foster. It was dedicated to Carl Sagan, who was an atheistic evolutionist, very famous. He's dead now. But it started out with a scene where there's all these satellite dishes pointed out into space. And that's actually a true thing. They have these pointed out there listening for what they might hear as far as intelligence coming in from outer space. And at the very beginning scene, Jodie Foster, who's supposed to be a research scientist, laying on the hood of her car, reading a book or whatever, and got earplugs in, and she starts hearing. You know what she's hearing? She's hearing thumps that are prime numbers. To her, that meant intelligence. The reason why, and the whole movie is about trying to find that alien intelligence. The reason why she did that is that it's dedicated to Carl Sagan, and that's what his life work was. Trying to find whether or not there's an intelligence out in outer space that's as good, that's as intelligent as we are. It's the whole purpose of behind some of the sciences. And until you understand that, you don't know how dedicated these people are to disproving God. Okay? Here's a couple of quotes. By the way, if you begin with the wrong assumptions, then you will come up with the wrong conclusions. And I think that too many scientists, very smart people, there are things that they do that are phenomenal, but if they start with the wrong assumptions, they don't come to the right conclusions. And that's hard. That was hard for me to understand because I was going to college with some pretty smart people for a long time. I spent 10 years in college. No, 20. I spent 20 years in college. 10 years and 10 years in different parts. Long period of time. 4 different universities. I studied under some really smart people. I tried to figure out how come these guys can be so smart and still not understand this. And am I wrong? Okay, I did. So here's a couple of quotes. This is Stephen Jay Gould, very famous evolutionist. All right? He's an evolutionary scientist. The absence of fossil evidence for intermediate stages between major transitions in organic design, indeed, our inability, even in our imagination, to construct functional intermediates are the fossils in between, in many cases has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution. Gradual meaning slow changes over time. He's admitting right there, we don't have a fossil record to show evolution is true. Here's another one. And this next guy was asked by another person. This guy wrote a book. His name is Patterson. He wrote a book on evolution, and he did not put any transitional forms in to show that in his book that evolution was true. And he was challenged on that. How come you did not put any of the fossil record in your book to show evolution? This is his answer back. I fully agree with the comment on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any fossils or living, I would certainly have included them. You suggest that an artist, which is often used just to depict this, should be used to visualize such transitions, but where would he get the information from? They do this all the time, but he refuses because he knows that's deceptive. I would not honestly provide it, and if I were to leave it to artistic license, would that not mislead the reader? This is an evolutionist. He knows there's a problem. This is the last one of the three. This is Ernst Mayr, very famous. I think he's deceased now. Given the fact of evolution, he says he knows evolution is a fact. Given the fact of evolution, one would expect the fossils to document a gradual, steady change from ancestral forms to descendants. But this is not what the paleontologist finds. So, what this movie is going to talk about, you guys don't mind if we take a couple extra minutes today, because I want you to watch this movie, but I got a couple more things to say to get you ready for it. What is this called? You guys seen this in a science book or anything before? This is the geologic column. This is the Jurassic period. So when you're talking Jurassic Park, they're talking about things that came in that particular period, which would be the dinosaurs. And all of these supposedly starts with the Precambrian and then the Cambrian. And the Cambrian has this burst of life at the beginning where there's the simpler life forms. And as you go up the geologic column, as you dig farther and farther into the earth, you get more complex and more complex and more complex until you get to us today, where you have the things we see around us that are living. All right, so that's a really famous column. It's used by evolutionists, but there's some problems with it, some major problems. First problem is there's no one place on Earth where this entire column exists. They act like it does by building it. You can find all kinds of pictures of it, just like I showed you in science books, online, every place. But there isn't a place where that is actually, there's no place on Earth where it does that. Another problem is the evolutionary model claims that the species depicted appeared in a nice, neat group as they lived and died over time. But that's not consistently true either. Many layers have a mixture of some of these. So if it was true that they were being evolved, that things were evolving in different layers and dying out, then you wouldn't find that one down in this layer occasionally, but they do. Okay? But they ignore it and try to figure out a way to tell a reason why that might happen. This is just the United States, and this is what they're trying to show you that the geologic column looks like, but this is actually what it looks like. So the different levels of the geologic column are found in different parts of the United States. Or I tried to find a map all over the world. I've seen one once and I couldn't find it again, where that Precambrian is the lighter orange, okay? And I can't find Cambrian on here. Anybody see it?
Cambrian, right?
That's a Precambrian. I'm trying to find the actual, there's one called Cambrian.
Oh, the dark blue.
Right there, okay? So dark blue, we only find up in Wisconsin and maybe along the Appalachian area there. Why isn't there any over here or in Michigan? All right. If we get up to the higher ones like the Jurassic, that kind of a lighter greenish color there, it's only in Texas, up in Minnesota, North and South Dakota, a little bit in Minnesota. All right. So the layers aren't like down, 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 down. Okay, now we got to the bottom, we can work our way up. It's in different parts of the world for each of the layers. I think that's very deceitful. We're going to see why. The third problem is that there are many examples of fossils which are found in massive graves all over the world, and an abundance of fossils which demonstrate instantaneous burial, not extinction over millions of years. I'm going to show you a few examples. Simple life forms, aquatic simple life forms at the top of Mount Everest and every other really, really tall mountain. All right? How can Cambrian levels be at the top? What is it? 23,000 feet above sea level? Yeah. And then the Jurassics are down at close to sea level in North Dakota. You see how this doesn't make sense? You know, this is true. All right? Here's another one. They're struggling to figure out that are studying the peak of Mount Everest. Oh, this is just some other life forms that are found at the top of Mount Everest. They found actual fish, not just the simpler ones. But what about something like this? You see the problem here? Mm-hmm. They're saying that these things were fossilized over a period of time. This one stopped in its tracks. It's eating another fish. And boom, done. Same thing here, same thing here. This one is giving birth. Oh, that's cool. Immediately stopped. Or, we're not talking about a fish died that got fossilized. We're talking about entire schools of fish instantaneously dying and being fossilized. Does that say gradualism or does that say catastrophe? Okay? I'm thinking more along the lines of a flood than I am billions of years now. All right?
And more likely a flood than an asteroid.
Yeah, exactly. What about the idea that there are very, very delicate things that are fossilized? A jellyfish doesn't last very long at all. Not at all. I mean, like, when it dies, it's disintegrated just like that. That's the fossil of a jellyfish. That's got to be pretty fast. Or some of these winged creatures here that are very, very delicate. Now, this next one, first time I saw one of these pictures, I couldn't believe it. Right. You know what those are? Tree trunks. Do you know what those lines are? Millions of years of layers. How did they get buried? Right. Over millions of years? How did that happen? They can't explain it. It doesn't happen. You got this layer, this layer, this layer, this layer, this layer, this layer, and you have a tree trunk run through all of them. That represents millions of years, or at least hundreds of thousands. If you don't bury something rapidly and get it covered up rapidly, it don't fossilize. Can't do it. Just how the process works. These things are all over the world. There are also what are called massive graves of tangled up webs of fossils that you can't hardly separate, as if something just came and whooshed them all in the same spot and instantaneously stopped them and then fossilized them all at once. Whoa. See, there are two different ways they know that fossils could be made. One of them is if you happen to cover it up and it was a long period of time, but the other way is with high pressure, instantaneously with salt water. It's a simple way of me saying it. I don't know the whole scientific way, but I read about it, and that right there looks a lot more, and this back here looks a lot more like that kind of fossilization process than one that took millions of years. Okay? And another one. So we got to ask ourselves a question. What best explains all of this? And that's what I want to do next by having you guys listen to, and this is going to take us almost to 11 o'clock. Okay, we got a little bit of a late start. We'll watch most of it. If we don't get quite all of it, that's fine. But this is a lecture, part of a lecture by Dr. Andrew Snelling, PhD in geology. There's 3 or 4 guys that I like to listen to right now that are really good, and he's one of them. And in this particular film, in this particular lecture, he's going to talk specifically about what we just mentioned. All right, not from a layman's point of view, but from a doctor of geology's point of view. All right, so here we go. Oh, by the way, while you're listening, I have a set of kinds of questions you might want to ask yourself, and I put them in order. You're going to cover these things in the same order that I've written them down. So you can kind of read the next one and then wait for it. Read the next one and then wait for it. All right, here we go.
Essentially, there's no evidence for the flood. You want to say to them, well, wait a minute, read to them what it says in Genesis and say, if that is true, what evidence would you look for? All flesh died. Wouldn't you expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid up all over the earth? And that's exactly what we find. 70% of the earth is covered the continents is covered in fossil-bearing sedimentary rocks laid down by water. But how do you get a fossil fish in the first place? Look at the beautiful preservation of that fish. Well, here's a fish about to have his breakfast, doesn't get time to swallow it before he's buried and fossilised. You get the point? You can't preserve a fossil like that where he's just about to take a chomp and he's frozen in an instant. In fact, here's another example from a museum in Germany. That's the marine reptile, 6 feet long, giving birth to a baby. 1 minute, mother is about to give birth to a baby. Split second later, she's buried in tons and tons of mud. Fossilisation had to be catastrophic, virtually instant and rapid. Here's a fossilised jellyfish. Jellyfish are soft. They melt in the sun or get ripped apart by the wind and the waves. Or these crinoids. Look at the heads of those crinoids of coelids. They're delicate. They have been preserved. Or the wings of this wasp. How do you fossilise a wasp like that if it's not rapidly and catastrophically buried? Or flowers. These are soft organisms that would not be preserved. I mean, you get a flower today and leave it out, what's going to happen to it? It's going to wither, die, and fall apart. No, to preserve these organisms, you need rapid, catastrophic deposition on a mass scale. So, what will the fossils show? They show evidence of death, disease, and destruction. They show evidence of rapid burial in a catastrophe, the flood. They also show evidence of sudden appearance, fully formed and complex, without any ancestors in the layers beneath them. Let me unpack that for you. Even a simple cell is complex. You ask any microbiologist who looks down a microscope, and they will tell you that the cell, you can fit on the size of a pinpoint, is incredibly complex. In fact, one biologist said, the cell is as complex as a city the size of New York or London, because it's got a brain, a control centre or a nucleus, it's got transport networks, it's got factories, it's got powerhouses, it's got all the ingredients that make up a mega city with all its complexity. So what do we find in the fossil record? We go from life to complex life. Cells, fully formed, fully functioning, ready. It's the same no matter what level we look at. These flatworms, there's no hint of any ancestors in the layers below them. They appear suddenly in the fossil record, fully formed, fully complex, like this trilobite. Now, most people think, well, that's trilobite, 3 lobes, it's got 3 sections to its body. By the way, you see it's got a head, that's the left-hand end. See those 2 knobs? That's the eyes of the trilobite, they've been fossilised. Our lenses, not these things that I have to wear, but inside here, the lenses in my eyes are made up of organic tissue. Not so the trilobite eyes, the lenses are made up of lime, the same mineral that's in limestone, calcite. And we can actually study the fossilised eye of the trilobite, and here it is. It's made up of multiple lenses, all focusing in different directions at the same time, incredibly complex, so this creature could look in all directions and have everything in focus while it's scurrying across the ocean floor. We, with our ingenuity, have only made similar land systems in the last 50 years by intelligent input and design. If that's the case today, what was it at the time of the trilobite? Do we find any ancestors of trilobites below that could indicate how such a complex eye could develop all of its own accord? Absolutely not. You know, it's like this. Millions of years of wind and water obviously carved out the president's head. You and I can all see the evidence of intelligent planning, design and input. That's what amazes me. There was Stephen Hawking using a voice synthesizer to be able to communicate with us, built by intelligent engineers who designed it, and he used that system to tell us we all got here by chance. So what do the fossils show? Evidence of death, disease and destruction, evidence of rapid burial, evidence of sudden appearance, evidence of design by an intelligent creator. We've just dealt with that. And evidence of no evolutionary transitions. You know, where are the missing links that hypothetically link one type of creature to another? Like here, half a reptile, half a bird. By the way, Stephen Jay Gould recognised this problem. He was known to say he was arguably the greatest evolutionist of the 20th century. And he made this comment, what use is half a wing or half a jaw? Think about it. A reptile that's on its way to becoming a bird, its legs are changing into wings. So when they're halfway there, they're not very good for running and they're not very good for flying. So how does it survive? By the way, feathers are more than scales. They're totally different. A bird is more than feathers. A bird has a different lung system, has a different heart system, a circulation system. It's radically different from a reptile. And in the fossil record, whenever we find skeletons that look like birds, they are true birds. Archaeopteryx was once said to be the ancestor of the birds, but we know it was a true bird with true feathers. Yes, it had claws on its wings and it had teeth in its bill, but we've got living birds with claws on their wings and teeth in their bill. Or this so-called transition from fish to amphibians, fins changing into legs. While the fins are partway fins, partway legs, it's also got to have the lung system, hasn't it, to breathe on air, on land as well as in the water, so it's got to change at the same time. What if it doesn't all change at the same time? The creature comes to a dead end and dies, just like it can't swim very well or walk very well. Oh, by the way, they touted a missing link between these two. They called it titillac. By the way, how many bones did they actually find? That's what they found. Can you see the evidence there of fins changing the legs? What was missing? The artist's imagination. Because you see, when you find a whole skeleton, you can see the feet or you can see the fins. You don't see anything in between. Oh, and by the way, they later found footprints of vertebrate animals below where they found titillac. So they knew that Titterlac couldn't be the ancestor of the four-footed animals because there were already four-footed animals around. And you'll often see these big announcements in the newspapers, missing link found. And about 2 months later, you'll find a little footnote where they've retracted it. They don't tell you when they retract it. They let you think that they've found it. Well, it's interesting to see what they actually say, the secular scientists. Here was Charles Darwin in 1859, in his book on the origin of species. This is what he said in his chapter 10. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which could be urged against the theory. So he realised there were none of these missing links. What was his explanation? The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geologic record. Well, in 1859, they hadn't explored most of the world, so we can excuse Charles Darwin. But what about today, when geologists and scientists convene in every corner of the globe? Has the picture changed at all? Well, Stephen Jay Gould agrees with Charles Darwin when he said the absence of fossil evidence for this intermediary stages between major traditions and inorganic design, indeed our inability, even in our imagination, to construct functional intermediates in many cases has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution. Did you get what he said? Not only can't we find them, we can't even imagine what they look like. David Ralph at the Chicago Field Museum of Natural History at the University of Chicago, arguably the greatest paleontologist of the 20th century with the largest fossil collection in the world in that museum. He said this in 1979. Well, we are now about 120 years after Darwin, and the knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. The record of evolution is still surprisingly jerky, and ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. Wait a minute, how many did Darwin have? None. We've got even fewer than that now. Boy, that isn't very convincing, is it? Some of the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record have had to be discovered and modified as a result of more detailed information. And you know, Colin Patterson at the British Museum of Natural History agrees. He wrote a book on evolution and he was asked a question in a letter, and this was how he responded. I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would have certainly have included them. Yet Gould and the American Museum people are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one can make a watertight argument. Wow. And you think that the museums are full of these missing links? No. Even Ernest May in 2001 wrote, given the fact of evolution, well, he believes it's a fact. No, it's only a theory. Not even a good one. Because it's easily falsified, but they don't accept that. But given evolution, one would expect the fossils to document a gradual, steady change from ancestral forms to descendants, but this is not what the paleontologist finds. Instead, he or she finds gaps in just about every phyletic series, gaps between the different sorts of organisms. Well, so what did the fossils show? They show evidence of sudden appearance, we covered that, with no ancestors in the layers, evidence of design by an intelligent creator. We just see evidence of no evolutionary transitions. Instead, we see evidence of many varieties of basic kinds reproducing after their kinds. Why do I use the word kind? Because that's the biblical definition of the different units of life. The term species is a man-made term. It's not in the Bible. And evolutionists have this tree of life, which we showed you before, where they believe that the first cell replicated and diverged and life went in all different directions. There was only one tree of life. Whereas the Bible says, no, there was a whole orchard. When God created, he made this bird to reproduce after its kind, the dogs to reproduce after their kind, the horses to reproduce after their kind. We see it repeated time after time in the book of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 1, and it's also in Genesis 6 and 7 for the flood. The animals would come to Noah, not as species, after their kinds. And so the Bible speaks of many varieties within each created kind. So that's why in the petting zoo we have here a horse and a donkey. Because zebras can mate with donkeys and horses. They're part of the horse kind. The kind is probably at the family level, and it's illustrated in the ark. There was probably only about 1,400 basic kinds that would need to go on the ark. And so that's not many animals to fit on the ark after all. You know it's a big boat because you've been down there and you've seen how big it is. And so when we get to the fossil record, what do we find? Trilobites are always trilobites. They don't change into something else. They're different shapes with different ornamentation, different sizes, but they're always trilobites. Or brachiopods or land shells. They have different ribs. They've got the same overall body plan. They look different from one another, but there's similarities in all their features. Just like dogs are always dogs. From Chihuahuas to Great Danes, they're all dogs. They look different, but you know that they're dogs when you see them. And they bark like dogs. And brachiopods are always brachiopods. So, we see evidence of many varieties of basic kinds, but reproducing after their kinds in the fossil record. And we also see that once a creature appears in the fossil record, it stays the same. Or you can see this fossil fish in the fossil record called the coelacanth. Supposed to have died out 65 million years ago. Until 1938, we found it living off the coast of Madagascar. We've even videotaped it swimming off Japan and off Indonesia. The geckos in the fossil record are identical to the living ones. And this Wallamite pine is an interesting story. The pine fossil is found about 120 miles west of Sydney, downtown Sydney, Australia, on the east coast. The living one was found in 1994 in a remote canyon in a national park in the Blue Mountains, about 60 miles from downtown Sydney and 60 miles from the fossil, and it hasn't changed. Exactly the same organism. The fossil was supposed to have died out 165 million years ago. So how did it survive in the same region for 165 million years and stay the same? It begs the question of the millions of years, of course. Fossil crabs are the same as living ones. Fossil crayfish are the same as living ones. We recognise beetles in the fossil record because they're identical to the living beetles. So, we find evidence of death, disease, destruction. We find evidence of rapid burial and catastrophe. We find evidence of death and extinction. And we find evidence of rapid mass destruction and burial on a global scale in the flood. Yes? We don't find the fossils as individuals. We find them en masse. If you don't believe me, go off the 275 into one of those road cuts, and that's exactly what the limestones, the hard layers that you'll find in all the road cuts around Cincinnati, full of corals, clams, brachiopods, and chimeras, all broken up and smashed up, bryozoans. The limestones are jam-packed with all the broken remains of these creatures, everywhere you look around this area. The museum is built on a fossil graveyard. You go to the Grand Canyon, one of the limestones there, you can see the mass of broken up remains of crinoids or corals. By the way, here's an Australian example. Fossil Bluff in Tasmania. It's on the northern coast of the island that sits off the southeast corner of Australia. There's an 80-foot high cliff, and we've got a mass of broken up clams and pebbles, indicating a mass burial on a turbulent scale. And in this fossil deposit, we find the remains of a toothed whale that lives in the deep ocean and a marsupial possum that lives on the land. When do you see whales and possums living together, by the way? You know, we need to extract observation from interpretation. When we see fossils, do we know that's where they died? No. Do we know that's where they lived? No. One thing we know is that's where they died where they buried because we observed them buried in the rocks in that location. So how do you get a whale and possum that didn't live together to be buried together? The ocean covered the land. Oh, here's a fossil deposit in southern Israel. See the boy for scale up there on the top right? Let's zoom in. What do we see? All these coiled ammonite fossils. Many of you are familiar with the chalk cliffs of the White Cliffs of Dover, the English Channel, made up of chalk, a type of limestone. Under the microscope, you can see trillions, literally trillions of microscopic shellfish. We'll come back to the chalk in a moment. But this is a mass graveyard of ginormous proportions. So we see evidence of rapid mass destruction and burial on a global scale in a catastrophe of the flood. All around the world, every continent is covered with these layers containing all these fossils on mass burial. What about the order of the fossils? Well, the order of the fossils in the rock layers, therefore, must be the burial order of the flood. And that makes a lot of good sense. Why? Well, if you go to the Grand Canyon, you get into these stromatolites, they're in the layers below the flood rocks. And so we're not surprised to find that some of these domes are stacked up in a linear structure that looks like a reef. That there might have been a reef system made of these slime mats building these domes that protected a lagoon near the coast of the pre-flood continent. And when the flood came, it buried that reef. And it buried the creatures that were in the lagoon before the waters rose up to cover the land. Why do I say that? Well, where does the Bible say the flood began? The fountains of the great deep broke open. The great deep was the ocean. So the flood began in the ocean when the ocean floor got ripped apart and water started coming out with hot molten rock. 70% and more that comes out of a volcano is water in the form of steam. So if the flood began in the oceans, which animals would get affected first by the flood? The creatures that lived on the ocean floor. So jellyfish and fossil flatworms, for example. And what I want to show you, and this is depicted in the flood geology room in the museum, just out this way. If you've been there, if you haven't, go there and look at our Allosaurus fossil, and also you'll see this diagram here. The horizontal sequence of rock layers with the fossils in them, the order of the fossils in that vertical sequence, represents the horizontal progression of the flood. As the waters rose over the ocean, what did they do? They first of all affected the creatures on the seafloor, on the shallow seafloor, the trilobites, the brachiopods. They couldn't easily escape. Corals are fixed to the ocean floor, so they can't escape. By the way, most people don't realise that 95% by volume and number of the fossils are the shallow water marine creatures, the shellfish, the corals, the clams. 95%. Now, to put that in perspective, less than 5% represents the plants, fossil plants. And fossil plants are a good example of those that are found in the coal, C-O-A-L. That black stuff they dig up to burn in a power station? Coal. That's fossil plants. In the United States alone, there is believed to be 7 trillion tonnes of coal. And that's fossil plants that represent less than 5% of the fossil record. It tells you how many orders of magnitude more of these shallow water marine creatures. By the way, the post-flood world that we live in is a desert compared to the richness of the pre-flood world that God created. And when we look at the fossil record, what do we find? We find marine fossils throughout the record. Yes, some became extinct, but many survived all the way through the flood. They didn't have to go on the ark, by the way, because they could live in the water and survive in the water through the flood. It was only the land-dwelling, air-breathing creatures that had to go onto the ark because all the land was going to be covered by water. There'd be nowhere for them to live. And there's evidence that on the pre-flood oceans, there was a floating forest. It's depicted in our flood geology room with a diorama. That is hollow plants, hollow trunks with hollow roots that couldn't live on land in soil because the roots weren't strong enough to penetrate soil, actually formed a tangled mass of roots in which there was organic debris that were like floating islands of vegetation in the pre-flood world. And when they got beached as a result of the flood, they formed the coal beds in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, eastern Kentucky, and eastern Ohio. These are the coal beds. And we often find the remains of these trees fossilised. And then as the floodwaters conquer the land, we find the land animals start to be preserved. The vertebrates become increasingly fossilised. Interestingly, we only find dinosaurs buried with naked seed plants. They make a lot about dinosaurs. There's probably only about 50 or 60 varieties of dinosaurs, families. And we only know that dinosaurs were buried with naked seed plants like cycads. As we go higher up, probably in altitude, we actually come to the mammals and angiosperms, the flowering plants. What am I saying in altitude? I'm saying as the waters progressively rode up onto the land. Think about it. If you go to the Grand Canyon today, at the rim at high altitude, you've got ponderosa pine and deer. At the bottom of the Grand Canyon, a mile down, you've got cacti and bighorn sheep. So if you flood the Grand Canyon, you get cacti and bighorn sheep fossilised together, but you get ponderosa pine and deer up here higher up, buried higher up. So the burial order, the order in the fossil record represents the burial order of the flood. Just a couple of quick other observations. We find trace fossils in the fossil record, like these worm burrows, where the worm was going down and suddenly realised that sediment was covering it up, so it did a U-turn. We call them escape burrows. We find all their trails, and we even find the trails of trilobites. But the interesting thing is, the trails of the trilobites were fossilised millions of years before the trilobites were fossilised. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't. But if it was during the flood, it would scurry along the ocean floor trying to escape being buried, leave behind its prints, and then get buried above where it left its prints. And we see that pattern in the fossil record. We find that the footprints of...
There's some more to this. It goes on the same way. In fact, the whole thing is like an hour and a half long. But I want to stop it there and just ask three fairly simple questions as observation. How does the Bible describe how the flood started? What's your initial recollection as to how you think the Bible says that the flood began?
I know, like you said, it says I don't remember exactly, but something from the depths exploding upwards, and then the firmament.
See, we're taught as kids the rains came down and the floods came up, and I remember struggling with that even as a young person as I got older to think about it. How could there be that much water? There were theories as to how there could be pockets of water after the initial creation, and then it was just like all dumped. But the Bible doesn't say it. If you look at that passage in Genesis, the very first thing it says is that the fountains of the great deep broke up. It's talking about volcanoes. It's talking about things where there was massive amounts of water, and I think the Bible does show, and we'll take another class to show this, that there may have been like a ring of water underneath the earth, and it cracked up, and it just burst forth. There's a guy named Walt Brown that has a really cool theory that I might come and show sometime when I get later into this series, of how that ripped almost like a seam of a baseball along where the ocean ridges are. And you can see that massive amount of volcanoes where that happened. And that the continent started drifting because they were floating on this massive amount of water. And they separated, and then finally, eventually, they came to rest because the water was out of them for the most part and coming back down onto the earth. And that when they started to stop, they were going at a speed where they started to buckle, and that's where the big mountains came from, was the buckling of the planets as the motion of the continents stopped. And you can see evidence of this on sides of mountains someplace where they look like they're a big bunch of wrinkles. If you look at the photographs of them, they're actually there. So, yeah, I think that the fountains of the great deep burst forth. So why is there complex or less complex life forms at the bottom of what they call the strata? because it happened in the oceans first. The biblical account is right. Why are the more complex life forms higher and higher and higher and higher into the strata? Because they could get away initially and get covered later in different places as they migrated, because this took a year. It took a year, okay, for all that to happen. Some of them had time to move to different places to get to higher ground. And then finally, why is there sometimes places where there's simple life forms and complex life forms buried in the same place? Places where those things couldn't live together. A fish cannot be dead and be fossilized in the same place that an antelope could be, because they don't live in the same place. It doesn't say where they lived, it doesn't say where they died, but it says where they were buried. It's a different question. And evolution doesn't look at it that way. And then he talks, of course, about the plants, the huge amounts of massive, tangled up, large plant life that makes up the coal mines in various parts of the world. And there's a very interesting, I may show some of it later. I started watching a guy named Stephen Austin, who is a geologist and a person that believes in creation. He studied Mount St. Helens, volcano that exploded in 1980. Within 10 years after, they were seeing the petrified trees starting to form the way that they do in the Grand Canyon, and they were seeing mat beds at the bottom of Spirit Lake forming into pre-coal beds in a short period of time, within 10 years, not over millions of years, which would be the same way that this guy is saying that the coal mines in Pennsylvania and stuff were formed. Okay? Same process, a lot shorter period of time, and there's evidence for it, but it's rejected because it doesn't go along with the narrative. Because the evolutionists, the person that is a staunch evolutionist that will not believe the Bible at all, has a preconceived idea that there cannot be a designer, there cannot be a God, so a matter came first rather than a mind came first. I think it's flipped. I think it's the other way around. The mind came first, created this stuff. At that point, I don't think there's a problem with believing in something like a flood or anything else, if that mind is as powerful as what the Bible claims it is. But you'll have people that are decent religious people. You'll have people that are go to college and learn a few things, and they're going to ridicule that point of view. Sometimes you just have to walk away. That's just the way it is.
So frustrating because it's like
It is.
It seems so obvious.
But I tell you what, we'll go back to the thing I started with at the beginning of all the lessons and what I started the class with. I don't get into whether or not there's fossils when I initially talk to somebody. I don't go into some of the more deep scientific things that they claim they found. Because I'm telling you that most people have never even thought of the fact that if this evolutionary process is true, that they came from a rock. I start there. Do you think that your complex mind, the minds of the most brilliant scientists, came from non-thought? If they can't answer that question,
Kind of seems like the brains are still wrong sometimes.
true.
Me too, though.
I had an answer about a week or so after that question you had about that muscle in the, this is off the subject of what we're talking about, that muscle in the hand that you saw. And I think I found what that muscle is online. The cool thing that I found is that it is actually found not just in that one guy who was a really good bow shooter they talked about, it's in about 80% of the people in the world. And it's more concentrated in some cultures than it is in others. So
is it just more developed then?
yeah, that's what it sounds like to me. All right? And I'm pretty sure we're talking about the same muscle, although I didn't read your article and you didn't read mine, so I can't tell for sure. But it's a hand muscle, and there was quite a few articles that talked about that particular thing and the possibility of it evolving. What it comes down to, I think, as a more complete answer for you, is that there are things called, that evolutionists called, I think they call, I can't remember the name now, vestigial bones or features or whatever. Like, for instance, when I was a kid, the big thing was the tailbone. We have a tailbone because we used to be monkeys and we don't need a tailbone anymore, so we don't have a tail anymore, but we still have the remnants of the tail. That was their thought. They know that's not true now, but a lot of people still think that. Another one is, and I showed this in a lesson about a week or two ago, a couple of weeks ago, that there are two bones in the back of a whale that they claim used to be the hind legs of the animals that crawled into the ocean to become a whale. But now they know that's not true, that they are actually important for the whale reproduction, and they are there on purpose.
I thought they believed that we came from the ocean.
This is one of the most confusing things for me, because yes, that's true. Zap the water, amoeba, fish, crawl up on land, but the most common theory now is that the land animal crawled back into the water to become a whale. And I know that's for a fact now because I've seen evolutionists go through that on tape and watch them explain it. Yeah, that's what they think now. And they can't even decide on what the original animal was. But as I said at the very beginning, there's a lesson on there about that online. You can see it. Richard Dawkins, which is a very, very famous atheist, explains it. Yes, there's transitional forms. See, we go from here to Rhodocetus, to Pakicetus, to this one, and then finally to the whale. Where do you draw the line? It's a perfect step-by-step system to go from this to the whale. But then I go and I find other articles, some by the people that actually discovered them, that say they're not. They found more complete skeletons, and they know that the others are all land animals, and they don't lead to the whale. But they never come out and say, "Oops, evolution might be in question."
I mean, they're still not admitting that the Big Bang is disproven, even though they found it in their telescope.
As a thing, us finding the ark is like crazy. Kind of, this is real, just right there. But
Now, you're talking about the one that they found in the mountain up in Turkey or wherever,
Yeah.
someplace. I read a lot of articles about it, and I actually have this Walt Brown I was telling you about. He's got a book out that I have, and his whole book's online. He worked for the government, and he says that he thinks that that's true, but nobody seems to be able to get up there and prove it. So it's something that I think might be true, but I don't use it in an argument because it's still a little bit skeptical as to whether or not that's actually the ark or not.
They did the scans on it from the surface, and they wanted to do an extraction, but they were told they couldn't.
Yeah, there's several things that show biblical history that because of geopolitics they can't get to, and the ark is one of them. Because of where it's at, the country doesn't want people in there, and you cause a world war if you went over and tried to do it. Another one is that in a certain place where the Red Sea maybe was parted, have actually found coral reefs that are in the shape of chariot wheels at the bottom. And one guy actually got down there and got pictures, but they can't get back down there again to extract them and see whether or not that's actually true. But I don't, like I said, I don't start out my arguments with that sort of thing. I start my argument with, do you think you came from a rock? Because if you think you came from a rock, so be it, evolution has to be true. But if you're smart enough to think that there was an intelligence behind your intelligence, then we can talk. Because that changes the picture and it changes the argument.